Hi there, Kurt McNamara, and this is a presentation for the deep discussion group that we run out of central the US, the Twin Cities, mostly in Wisconsin. And it's a lot allied or associated with an innovation group. And so we have Zoom meetings every couple of weeks. And if you're interested in these kind of topics, contact me via one of these ways here. So the focus of today is modeling and emergence. And this is part of a series on modeling and simulation. In this group, one person finds a theme and then other people chime in on a monthly basis with an aspect of it or their view of it or whatever. It's pretty informal. This one's pretty darn structured just because I've done this presentation a couple times. I want to record it. All right, so let's see if we can kind of go through some of this. So where do we find emergence? Well, the answer is everywhere. And one of the books that I read, A Different Universe by Robert Laughlin, says, well, that's true because everything we see, we perceive, we call it the Newtonian universe, right? It consists of elementary particles that we can't see, but they associate into atoms, which associate into molecules and stuff. All right. Well, that's all emergent on quarks, right? And quantum mechanics. So everything we see essentially is emergent because of that. And there's a nice I thought overview in Wikipedia of it. So that's a good thing to look at. And let's see. All right. Now, this viewpoint was taken up by Len Troncalli and others decades ago. And there are theories that basically, besides the things that we commonly associate with emergence, and typically when we say emergence nowadays, we think about behavioral emergence, right? Something like, oh, isn't it interesting how ants, which are each following a fairly simple program, can have this very complex structure, very complex set of behaviors, right? They take away the waste to a particular spot, they bury the dead, they adjust the temperature in some cases, they might farm fungi in some cases. And how does that surprising behavior emerge from lower level interactions? And so we commonly think of that. And that's in this diagram if you take a look at it clearly. However, there's a bunch of stuff there, right? And so Len, like I said, back in the, what is probably like late 1970s, said, well, subatomic particles, right? And then he goes into stars and galaxies and whatever. And so this is his unbroken sequence of system origins. And there's a nice video on YouTube where he goes into this at some length. So if you're interested, let me know. So I've gone through a number of books and I just went through Everything is Emergent by Morowitz and actually rereading it after some time, like, aha, yes, he says the same thing. So if we go through his 28 levels with a little modification and a little condensation, if you will, from me or organization, we got the elements, right? So he starts there, so we're beyond the quarks into elementary particles, we're beyond the particles into atoms. He's saying the elements, that's a pretty big deal. And then space itself, he says, well, why is there something or anything? There's large scale structures like galaxies, there's stars and solar systems and planets, etc. In Earth, there's a geosphere, right? The planet or the continents moving around, and a biosphere. Then, of course, life arose. And Life's Edge, I think by Zimmer, is got a nice overview of all the different things that are just on that edge between life and not life, if you want to think about that. But the two different kinds of cells, right? Prokaryotes. And so then what's emergent about them? Well, not just the cellular boundary and the nucleus, but metabolism, replication, and what he calls macromolecular synthesis. Photosynthesis, huge emergent thing. Eukaryotes, in the fact that they had organelles inside. Multicellularity and organs, of course, right, come out of that, and bodies and etc. Respiration and digestion. And neurons, okay, that's a pretty surprising thing. Subkingdoms of creatures, right? You got the invertebrates and the vertebrates, And then if you look at that a little bit more, you've got the vertebrates, of course, and then sort of, we came out of that. I should probably rearrange this, but anyway, you got the fish, the amphibians, the reptiles, and the mammals, and then of course all the mammals. And then under hominids, he puts a bunch of behaviors that are emergent behaviors, including we made tools, we sort of invented language, we sort of invented agriculture, we went together in cities, we developed technology, and then even philosophy and spiritual, he's saying. So then I typically would have started with this, and what are the classic examples people are familiar with? Well, slime mold is one, right? That's these amoebas moving around until they run out of food, and then they emit a chemical, and that chemical is sensed by other amoebas, and they then move towards each other. When enough of them come together, they form a multicellular structure, which then produces a fruiting body, and then spores go out, and the whole thing starts over again. It's an astonishing thing. Biological clocks and flocks and ants and scales on a fish. One scale is interesting, right? Just like one shingle, but you only really get much out of it, or feathers, right? When you have a whole bunch of them. So, it's this level scale thing. Water is a common example, right? From just looking at hydrogen, just looking at oxygen, you wouldn't know all the properties of water. If you knew the properties of water as a liquid, you wouldn't necessarily know as a solid or, crystalline structure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, up to turbulence and flow. Typically, this has been characterized, I think John Holland's watchmaker thing, which is that if you have to start over all the time, like an evolution, you wouldn't get anywhere very fast. But if you conserve these cool things, right? It's like the watchmaker, right? If the watchmaker's interrupted every half hour, and every half hour he has to, or she starts again, doesn't get very far. But if in the half hour they make a module, and the module's then there the next time, then they can really continue to make watches. And that's a big, big deal. It turns out our DNA is full of these past conserved structures. Everything's DNA is, since that's a big, big deal. Behavior, self-organizing behavior, properties at one level don't predict the next, etc. Hierarchy levels, this once again is just like I said before, the evolution of brain. There's a very good bunch of books about this, that we went from hunter-gatherer to agriculture to et cetera, and each time basically either our brain itself and or sort of the programming we put on it from a societal level, then we got up to like, oh, now we behave like agricultural people, right, where we used to be just hunter-gatherer people, right? And so then we'd sort of develop separately. This is one explanation for why maybe Homo sapiens did better than Neanderthals, simply because Homo sapiens were in a little bit larger group, typically, right? And that allowed them, their specialties to have more members and maybe better performance. And then quantum mechanics and all stuff that comes out of that. So a lot of stuff here. Emergence and evolution is a big deal. And I'm not even really going to get into it. We mentioned some of the higher level stuff before. And just to say here in the lower right corner, conserved properties, it's really what we're talking about, right? Multicellularity and body plans, things that once they develop, then boy, that's successful, right? So it's going to happen over and over again. Now, because this group connects up with the innovation group, it's worth mentioning that there's a book called Evolutionary Innovations, and by Nitecki. It's actually a bunch of chapters which are papers, and this particular one, he was saying, well, if you look at the development of something like feathered flight, you can look at, these 5 or 6 sort of different, detectable, groups of species that had a certain attributes, but only in some of them did the innovations occur, right? And so then it's kind of interesting, at some point, and it's probably a little bit too small to read, but I'll PDF these if you want to. But, the things that happen at those stages, like I think it's 1, 2, and 4, you got 3 or 4 different things happening at once. And then the other ones, you just like, you further develop, but you didn't have new innovations. So he said innovation is new characters or structure function complexes that manifest in the phenotype, and that expresses itself as morphological, like body shapes. Behavioral, we talked about social insects, are physiological, and that might be things like respiration. And biologically, they might say it's a new way of making a living. It's a structure or property that allows you to perform a new function or open a new adaptive zone. And it turns out there's sort of 2 different things. Like when life moves into a new territory, all of a sudden new species appear in the record. But then within a territory, you get subspecies. So there's an interesting thing there. So this was originally, part of this was in a presentation on how to teach systems and natural systems, bio-inspired design. And so just saying that, this is one of the interesting ways to talk about systems, because what is the fundamental thing about a system? It has properties unpredicted by the behavior of the parts. That's a Bucky Fuller idea. It goes back further than Bucky, of course. He called it synergy, which of course is ubiquitous now, but at the time he started using it, it was only really well known in chemistry, where it talked about surprising things that happened when molecules were formed, right? That chemists were like, well, yeah, you put these things together, these molecules, and all of a sudden, caffeine, methane. We wouldn't have figured out caffeine or methane just looking at how C and H and O, et cetera. So, and these are examples from mass nature. Now, modeling it, which is what we're talking about at the moment, is that that we often do it from a complex adaptive system perspective. And we often use the tool called NetLogo if we're trying, especially to teach a student about it. There are other ways to do it, right? System dynamics models and sort of, when we model what we call chaotic systems or even predator-prey systems, they have attractors, and that's an emergent behavior as well. And then structure behavior function is another way to model. And I'm not sure it links up clearly with emergence or not, but it is another way to model systems. And then, so then in a complex adaptive system, you have agents and you have the environment, and then you have these tags and messages. And I should have on here conditional action, because that's the other part of this that's important in a complex adaptive system. Oops, so go back one. So then there's a great paper, Francis Eidlgen, on modeling emergence. And he says, well, really there's a few characteristics about it. If you're going to model it, one's the amount of variety, which is the possible states it could take, or how many different kinds of subsystems it have. In complex systems, he says, really there's a reduction in variety when you get to something where it goes towards an attractor. And we talk about the Cunningham framework. So there's a thing there. There's a combination of internal variation and external selection, or vice versa, right? And so there's different cases here. There's attractors and adaptation and crystals and or behavior patterns being mimicked. The number of levels at the level of just one level, you're problem solving, like a new way to find food. At two, you sort of have a limit cycle that looks like a dynamical system, and at multi-level, you might have the things like we do, right? The humans and all the stuff we talked about. Really, another way to view it is via constraints. And the emergence is this constraint on further variation, right? Because there's a structure, we're conserving the structure. The vertebrates continue to look like vertebrates, right? And they're, interestingly enough for us, one of those ways to view it is sort of as an attractor or a crystalline thing, and the other one is as knowledge. So it could be that emergence in knowledge, there's an opportunity and a constraint there, right? When there's sort of a known way, right, to look at a problem, that's sort of an emergent view, right? And then we don't have a bazillion ways to view it, if you will. All right, and then meta systems transitions. So this gets fairly nerdy. Okay, so then this is the same thing I said before, or this is how we do the kind of modeling, the agents, the environment, the tags, etc. And so here's NetLogo, and I'll show you a little bit NetLogo in a minute. And one of the interesting things about it is, besides biology, there's a lot of nice examples from things like chemistry. So what they call a BZ reaction shows emergence. And so here's a typical page, and here's some additional information I can get to you if you want. But Steve Thompson, at one point in one of his groups, did a sort of an explanation for all of us of agent-based modeling basics. And so he took, I think, some sort of a MOOC on this and really dove more deeply into it. So if you want to get into it and build your own, we can get you this stuff. And that's all from him. And then there's also higher level models you can get into. And once again, I'm not going to touch on this at all. So there are some references. All right, so then I'm going to stop that sharing for a second. And then I'm going to share again. And I hope, sometimes this one is fussy. There it is. Okay. Okay. So now you should be able to see net logo. And so this is the end state of the emergent sunflower model. So if I set it up again, so anyway, this is when you load up models, or what you see, you push setup, and you can change setup, but setup basically says, well, we're going to randomly put some agents in here, right? And then you tell it to go, or you could tell it to step. If you click on the info tab, it'll tell you, here is what this model is all about. Here is what it's based on. Here's an easy explanation of it. Oh, and here's the scientific paper it's based on. And then here's the actual code. And you can just go in there and change the code. Like I have my students pick a model that looks interesting and then change the labels and change the parameters and find out how that might be a better model of their system. So anyway, if this one goes, what you'll see is it shows that sunflower, it doesn't like go clockwork, and adding the next element, right? There's some other stuff happening there. So that's the sunflower. Now, if I go up to, let's see, the models library, and now I suppose you won't be able to see that. Let's see. I can make this new share. And let's see, models library. Okay, there we go. So hopefully you see the models library now. So here's all this biology stuff, and here's where I picked emergent sunflower, right? And just going back there, we could look at ants, and we could look at bees finding a new hive, and we could look at all kinds of stuff, right? And basically what it's demonstrating is this high level interesting behaviors based on simple interactions and simple rules, and you can change those rules and see what happens. And let's see, but here chemistry and physics, you have diffusion limited aggregations, or in chemical reactions, I mentioned the BZ reaction. And let's see, I think I have to, let's see, I have to reshare it. So hang on, guys. There it is. Okay, so here's the BZ reaction. So you set it up. And so this is a mixture of two different kinds of molecules. And so it just randomly distributes them. Maybe it's more than three, more than two. It looks like 3 or 4. And then you can change the sliders to see how it changes. But what you can see is that various regions develop, right? And they're more or less stable, and they come and go over and over and over again. Well, okay, not if you turn K2 too high. So it is interesting. Anyway, you can change this, and then it'll change how big they are, how small they are, right? So it's interesting stuff. Okay, so that's kind of where I wanted to get to. And like I said, I have students typically go and play with NetLogo, find 2 or 3 interesting models, and then I say, come back and tell the class about them and tell us how one might apply to your system. Now, it's a bit of a force fit. This is in the MCAD Sustainable Design Program, a bit of a force fit because they aren't creating a model based on something, right? And, many times it is something like, well, how does an idea propagate? Or how would this thing, hit a limit, or that kind of a thing. But it still turns out to be very useful because many of them have never done this sort of thing. And there's actually a lot of beauty in this. So yeah, that's what I'm going to say for now. And once again, like I said, if you want to find out more about this group, get hold of Kurt, and we'll talk to you soon.